endurance, and I hope that your time's been well invested. Let me do an advertisement. I don't like to push this kind of thing, but I do want to make this sort of thing available. After my wife passed away, I looked especially for things that were written about being a widow or a widower in the brotherhood, and I found very little available. And so I decided to commit myself to writing about the subject of the loss of a spouse and learning to live with that. In 2020, during COVID, when I couldn't go out and do a lot of workshops, I wrote this book called When the End Comes. And then in 2021, the next year, I wrote this book, Before the End Comes, because I thought there ought to be a lot of things that married people needed to know prior to the time that they lose their spouse to help them to transition from being married to being widowed. And this book is written for married people and for widowed people, because widowed people will really relate to this because they've already experienced that loss, but it's written especially with the married people in mind and what might help them in light of the fact that there's only one way good marriages end. Now, bad marriages can end in all kinds of awful ways. Good marriages only end in one way. What are we doing to help prepare people in good marriages for the end? There was a beginning, at the ceremony. There's going to be an end. That's at death. I know that's not a pleasant concept, but it's a reality. And so I wrote the first book, When the End Comes, the second book, Before the End Comes, and then in 2023 I wrote this book, After the End Comes, which talks about some issues that some of which I've never seen written in other books by folks in the Brotherhood. Like, for instance, male-female relationships after loss. Sex after the death of your spouse. What do you do about the rings after loss? There's all kinds of interesting, unique things about life after the loss of your spouse. Now, you can buy these on Amazon. If you're a Kindle person, you can get them for $5 Kindle through Amazon. If you like the hard copy, I bring some with me everywhere I go. There are some sets back there. These are typically, if you bought them on Amazon, they're more expensive. But when I travel, you can get them for $8 a piece, or you can buy all three for $20. And if you're interested in it, you can get them back there at that table. They're on the left-hand side of the table, these books of mine, and you can just leave the money on the table back there. On the right side of that table are some other books that are not for sale. They're a part of my library. They're interesting books that could be of help to you if you'd like to read about the subject of grief, the loss of a spouse, or just dealing generally with the difficulties of life, because those are a lot of the books there on the right that helped me a lot when I was struggling with a life that I didn't want to live, but was forced to have to deal with. So we mention those things if they could be of help to you. If you've never ordered books from Amazon before, and you're interested in any of those books on the right-hand side, just take a picture with your phone and then hand your phone to somebody younger than you are, and it is amazing what happens. A couple days later, it's right there at your doorstep, and you can say, "Praise the Lord," and "Thank you, younger person, for doing that for me." Okay. Now, this, in my opinion, is the most important session of any workshop I ever do, and here's the reason why. For the vast majority of people, the greatest loss that they experience is the loss of their spouse. Now, here's my theory. If I wanted to have a workshop and teach people about how to deal with severe financial loss, or just financial loss generally, what I would do is I would look at it first and foremost from the greatest financial loss that a person could experience. I mean, when they're just totally blown away, reduced to zero. Because if people learned the facts and the principles that can help you navigate the worst financial loss, then they have the facts and principles to help them with lesser financial losses. Now, with that same theory, that's what we're doing here in this session. For most people, the greatest loss they will experience is the loss of their spouse. The research has been done about stressors, life stressors. Usually the academic people, when they do this research, and then they quantify and categorize losses from greatest to lesser. Usually there's 100 in these studies. Every study I've ever seen, number 1 and number 2 are the same. The number 2 life stressor is divorce, and the number 1 is the loss of a spouse by death. Those have great effect in people's lives. So with that in mind, I want to take you on a journey in regard to this severe loss, because in the process of doing this, you will also see how that a lot of things a widowed person experiences, several of them are very similar to somebody who loses. It could be a father, it could be a child, it could be a divorce and the loss of their marriage that way. It could be the loss of their child to the devil. A lot of the things that are involved with grief generally are just simply magnified when it comes to the widowed person, because that was their greatest blessing, to enjoy life with a person they loved. So it's with that in mind, I want to introduce to you Millie. Now, no offense to any widowed person in this church. Millie is my favorite widow. I was preaching in a gospel meeting at the Groesbeck Church of Christ on the north side of Cincinnati. And the preacher came to me that week and said, "Dean, I've got this 90-plus-year-old woman who wants to take you out to lunch." Now, I had lived with a wife for decades and had 3 daughters, and I know it's dangerous for a man to say no to a woman, especially if she's over 90. So I said, "Hey, Mark, go ahead and set it up. Any day, wherever she wants to go, that's fine." So Millie takes me to a Japanese restaurant, which I thought that was weird, okay? I did not know 90-plus-year-old women ate at Japanese restaurants, but Millie did. So she takes me to this restaurant, and we order. And the waiter walks away, and I turn to Millie, and I love to do this with widowed people. I said, "Millie, tell me your story." I said, "Tell me your story of love and loss." So she proceeds to tell me about this guy that she was married to for 63 years. She tells me about what a wonderful husband that he was, and what a great father that he was. And she told me about him getting cancer, and she told me about the caregiving, and she told me about him dying. She was married to him for 63 years. And then she dropped this conversational bomb. But that wasn't my first husband. I was shocked. After 63 years with this man, I said, "Millie, tell me about your first husband." She said, "I was 19 years old, and I was pregnant, and we already had a 1-year-old child." And she said, "My husband was in General Patton's army in the Battle of the Bulge, and he died there." She said, and I quote, "I had him buried in France, a decision that to this day I regret." It's hard to keep the tears from falling down the cheek. When I shared that anecdote in Millie's life at the Cold Harbor Church outside of Richmond, Virginia, there was a guy there who was big into genealogy stuff, and he had access to certain things, and he was able to actually get me a photograph of the grave marker of Ray Farmer, age 21, in France. And it's in my office. You know, after I heard Millie's story, I would tell her story other places. And sometimes I had her number and she got my number, and I would call her and I'd say, "Millie, I told your story someplace." And I wanted her to know that her story was very inspirational. Because I want you to stop and think with me about this for a minute. If you've not already been touched, this is mid-1940s. This kid is 19 years old. She's married. She's already had a child a year ago. Now she's pregnant with a second child. And her husband dies over in France. Now, how in the world did that 19-year-old teenager navigate those next few years in her life? I was inspired. One of the reasons I know that if I need to be a widower for the rest of my life, I know I can do this, is because Millie Hartman did what she did in the mid-1940s. It was 4 years after Ray died that she got married to this guy that she was married to for 63 years. Isn't that a sweet story? Wow. Don't you ever think that you and the Lord can't handle something. Amen. Because she's living proof of the fact I can and I will by the grace of God. Amen. Wow. Sweet, sweet story. Well, how do you get to be a widow or a widower? Well, the first thing you do is you get hitched. And the second thing you do is you stay hitched. Now, not everybody who gets hitched stays hitched. And then you have to be the one that keeps living. And tag, you're it. You're the widowed person. Now, did you ever think that whenever you said I do, you joined the ranks of the prospective widowed people? I never thought that. Why would I? Why would anybody? But that is the reality. You see, the only way you can be widowed is you have to get married first. So when you say I do, you become a prospective widowed person. And again, the only way a good marriage ends is death. And that leaves a widow or a widower behind. Now, I'm going to ask you to think out loud with me together. In a group this large, this should be real easy. You all are a very talkative bunch. I've had a hard time restraining you more than most groups, okay? So, okay, now, I'm the driver of the bus, okay? So you listen to me, okay? Okay, but I'm going to get you started. And I want you to tell me what in our culture we commonly associate with widowed people. Now, I'm going to get you started with one. I was in Medina, Ohio. It was the second workshop I ever tried to do. I asked this question. Denny Hickerson was sitting halfway back on the right-hand side. He raised his hand. Now, he's a married man. I think he has 3 children at this point. And I knew him because I had him at camp when he was a high school kid. And I called him out by name and I said, okay, Denny, get us started. What in our culture do we associate with widowhood? He said, old. I said, yeah, Denny, we do associate that with widowhood. But cool your jets, Denny. I said, you know what? There's a lot of widowed people who aren't old. Carla Cass, her daddy was a preacher in East Tennessee. One Sunday, he called upon his son-in-law to substitute preach for him. So he puts his Bible on his motorcycle and he seeks the destination 45 minutes to where his father-in-law preached. And there was a boy in a truck that got in front of him. And Carla Cass's husband died in that motorcycle accident when he was headed to preach that Sunday. That's not fair. That is not right. 3 children, young widow. If I could take you over to West Tennessee, I could introduce you to Cynthia. Cynthia and her husband, 29 years old. They're big cotton and soybean farmers. One day, he went out to crank up the welder to weld on a truck that had a diesel tank on the back. In that tank was 75% diesel fuel, 25% fumes, which is not a problem if he's welding, but what he didn't know was there was a pinhole leak in that tank. When he cranked up that welder, it blew up the building and blew his body out of the building. Cynthia, 29 years old, runs and gets all kinds of comforters and blankets soaking wet in the bathtub, brings them out and throws them on her husband's body. He was life-flighted to Memphis. And within, I think, 48 hours, he died. This is the fall, and the field is white for harvest. Cotton. I was so proud of those Crockett County, West Tennessee farmers who, when the time came, they dropped everything in their life and went and harvested that crop for Cynthia. Can you imagine 29 years old, 3 kids, and she's widowed? I could take you up to Canton, Ohio. I could introduce you to this guy. He and his wife, so kind-hearted that they adopted special needs children. They were really special need children because they had a wonderful, caring, compassionate heart. One day, she goes to take a nap in her early 40s and never wakes up. And now he's living as the single father parent of 3 very needy children in his early 40s. I can take you down to see Brittany. One morning she woke up and her husband Bradford went up to Trenton, Tennessee because he was skilled and trained and educated in helping children. And he was in a horrific accident in Trenton, Tennessee, and he died. I read her blog in her life after that loss, and they were married for about 1,300 days. And she woke up one day as a young lady, married, and before the sun went down, she was widowed. I could take you to see Buffy, who teaches in a faith-based school, who had conversations with her husband every day at noon, at lunchtime. This one particular day, she was concerned about the conversation, and she hung up. She went to the car and decided to drive home, but it was a 45-minute commute. She called her father on the way and said, "Dad," her dad was a law enforcement officer, "would you go to the house because I'm concerned about him?" Fortunately, her father did get to the house first. And he found his son-in-law dead. He had committed suicide. Buffy and her husband had a child a little over a year old. Don't tell me that you have to be old to be widowed. The only thing you have to be, the prerequisite, is to be married. And life, like we talked about yesterday, very uncertain. That's why I challenge every married couple, don't let a day go by without expressing your gratitude and feeling it sincerely for the blessing of being able to enjoy life married. Because when you lose it, you'll be shook to the core of your being. But learning about this experience will help. Give me something else now that we might relate to widowhood in our culture. Quickly, can you give me 3 or 4? Go.
Women.
What?
Women.
Women! There are way more women who are widowed than men. 3 to 4 times, by the way. There are over 15 million widowed people in the United States. Now, if you break that down male, female, 65 years and older, 37% of the women 65 years and older are widowed. 37%. That's way over a third. 37% of all the women 65 years and older are widowed. Now, if you drop that number down to 55, women 55 years and older, 32% of all women 55 years and older, 32%, that's nearly a third, are widowed. The average age of a woman when she's first widowed in our country. Now, when you think about being widowed, don't we typically think about the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, those decades of life? The average age of a woman when she's first widowed in our country is 57. Now, with the boatload of women who lose their spouses in the 60s, 70s, and 80s of life, how many of these younger ones would you have to drive that number all the way down to 57? That's the average age of a woman when she's first widowed. 3/4 of all married women in our country are going to experience widowhood. Yes, more women than men. I'm living proof, though, that it can happen to men, too. Now, something else that you might associate with widowhood. Misplaced. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, the animated version. The Island, what's it called? The Island of Misfit Toys. A widowed person is a social misfit in a coupled world. Now, you may think, coupled world. No, coupled world. Let me give you a couple of examples. I did a workshop in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Somebody came with me who graduated from the same high school I did, female, and she went there with me because she knew about the workshop. She'd attended another workshop. She was very helpful, and she kind of assisted me in some different ways. So we were fixing, I'll use that since I'm south of the Mason-Dixon line, we were fixing to leave. So we went to the Albuquerque airport, and one of my bags was over 50 pounds, so I had to take some out of one, put in another. So what I did was I took some out of one, I handed it to the guy that was the ticket clerk. Amy was at my right. And he took those things from me, he extended them to her and said, here, I'll give them and have your wife hold them while you change the stuff in your bag. What was his assumption? We were married, because we live in a coupled world. And when you see adults out in public, male and female, they're married. Oh, not necessarily. I was at the Freed-Hardeman University Bible lectureship. Every year when I went there, and I left my wife up in Ohio, I always bought something at the associates table. They raise money for scholarships for students there. They always have really neat things that a lot of women like, and so I always bought something and took home. Well, okay, I'm approaching, this was just this past year. I approached the table, and as I approached the table, the lady on the other side of the table said, now, before you go home this week, make sure you purchase something so you can take it home to your wife. So right then I thought, what am I going to do? Do I say something or do I not say something? And I real quickly kind of processed that, and I thought, I'm going to say something primarily for her benefit, but I'm going to be careful about how I say it. So I explained to her that I'd lost my wife. Of course, what did she say? I'm sorry, okay. But what was her assumption? That I was married. Well, see, we live in a coupled world, and widowed people are social misfits. Also, people who have never married are misfits. People who have experienced divorce and are not married, they are social misfits. Yes, Jim?
May use that from their perspective, the widow, they're misfits, but let me use a stronger term. From our perspective, you look, sometimes they're lepers.
Yes.
You treat them as,
okay.
treat them as social lepers.
Okay, I was in Florida. I was having this workshop. One of the elders came, a former elder of the church, came up. And when he came up, now, he's not an elder anymore. He's lost his wife. And he comes up to me, he extends his hand, and he says, thank you very much. I'm so glad to find out I'm not a leper. He's a widower, not a leper. But he felt the ostracization, the disconnect, the social disconnect. Yes, ma'am?
Yes. I was 38 when I lost my first husband.
38 years old when you lost your first husband.
I had 3 children. And I was very social in the church here. So the church was my family then. But the thing was, it's like you said before, everybody thinks a widow that young is out to find another husband. Wait a minute.
You're not done? Okay.
Listen, that's why I came to this meeting. Anyhow, with the 3 kids, one in grammar school, one in high school, and one in college. What does a 38-year-old do that cuts hair? Well, she goes and cuts hair and tries to make a living for her family.
That's the same thing Carla Cass did after her husband died on the motorcycle accident.
Yeah.
She cut hair at great clips
Yeah. Well,
to get by.
very good. Anyhow, cut most everybody's hair in the church, which helps about fine.
Well, I've noticed some people you don't have to cut their hair.
No, well, Ron, who sits here and preached here for 37 years, I started out cutting his hair.
Did he preach better because of how good you cut his hair?
Probably.
Well, he looked good anyway.
Okay, one other thing. One other thing. I have to admit, it was about almost 5 years, and I was ostracized from a lot of things that went on, like you said, and I was having to try to get the children educated. And then I thought, how am I going to get through all this? And that's when I started thinking about marriage again. And it's not a sin to think about marriage again if you've got...
After lunch tomorrow, we're going to be talking about that very issue.
Okay.
And man, you talk about complicated.
I'll shut up.
Okay. Does somebody have a piece of paper? I want her to write that down. I want to sign that and have it notarized. She said she was going to shut up. You all are a bunch of hoots. Yes, ma'am. Back there in the back.
The thing being widowed young, who have children, they're in going to school events, whatnot, and you're there with the other parents who are, and you
Married.
feel so alone.
Yeah.
You feel so ostracized out in public. There is an awkwardness, a social awkwardness about not being married in public, especially if you've had the blessing of enjoying marriage and enjoying being normal in a coupled world, but then you find yourself struggling with this totally different set of circumstances. It's extremely difficult. Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
I was just going to comment on Joyce. I met her a few years after she was widowed.
A few years after she was 38, okay.
And when she got stressed, she waxed her floor. And she had
You know, that's why I love you. I was the same way.
Yeah.
I had the cleanest floor.
she had about a half inch of wax on the floor.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes you need to throw yourself into some physical activity to kind of help you process something. That's the way some of us are. Yeah, exactly. Give me something else that you might associate with widowhood. Yes, ma'am.
So, my mom was 40. Let's see.
Your mom was 40-something?
My mom was, yeah, she was about 49 when my dad died.
Okay, about 49 when your father died. Go ahead.
I was 8 years old, and I had.
And you were only 8 years old.
Yeah, I had a 7-year-old sister, and she stayed a widow until the day she died, because
How old was she when she died, approximately?
87,
And she was widowed, how old?
at about 49.
Wow, from 49 to upper 80s, and she lived
Yeah.
a widow all that time.
She did. But one of the things she would always say, I can still hear her saying it, was she wouldn't go to things because she felt like a third wheel.
Hmm.
That was what she would say all the time.
Yeah, you feel out of place because it's a coupled world. Now, isn't it interesting that church is a public place, and it can be, for some people, one of the hardest public places to go. Because if you have come to church and worshiped with your husband or wife, that is a real, where do you sit?
Together.
Because I suspicion this church is like most. You have assigned seating here. Okay? You already confessed. Okay, I know where, in Murray City, Tennessee, I used to poke fun at that church because they not only had assigned seating, they had assigned parking. Are you always park in the same place too? And could you imagine coming to a Living with Lost workshop and laughing so much? But this is, see, people need to quit being so threatened by these things. These can be positive, thought-provoking experiences.
Amen.
But yeah, where are you going to sit? I'll tell you the two hardest places for a widowed person to go. And this is from extensive research, not scientific in nature, but I know way more widowed people than I know way more widowed people than the normal person, but I'm not normal, so I shouldn't say that. Okay, I know a lot of widowed people. My conclusion from talking to a lot of widowed people, there are two places really hard to go. One is the public place of worship. I'm convinced that what song leaders need to do before they choose their songs for Sunday is run their list of songs by every widowed person in the church to get permission to sing that song. I'm just joking, okay? But it's amazing how widowed people talk about a certain song that's sung, a certain experience they see, observe during worship, something the preacher says or something in a prayer. Coming to church is a hard thing to do for a widowed person, for most widowed people. The second place is going to bed. It is an in-your-face reminder. You are A-L-O-N-E. That is hard every night. It's very difficult. Give me one more. Somebody want to mention something that you'd relate to widowhood? Yes, ma'am.
Poverty.
Poverty. I would call it financial jeopardy, the potential of being financially at risk. Now, I'm going to real quickly share a bunch of stuff with you. Because of time, and I know that you have a life, and you don't want to spend the whole afternoon here. Whenever we suffer the loss of anybody of great value, and obviously a spouse is the one that is your first priority among human beings, you're going to experience grief. Now, you also might experience relief. What if, now not everybody has a good marriage. What if that husband who's passed away, because of him you experience domestic violence and he dies? And instead of experiencing a lot of grief, you experience more relief than you do grief. How's that going to make you feel? If you're supposed to be feeling overwhelmed with grief, how's that going to make you feel? You're guilty. Okay, now, what about if you can't control your tears and you start tearing up in front of other people or in public, and some of the saltiest tears are cried in church buildings during worship? Whenever you start tearing up or crying in the presence of somebody else, what do you say? I'm sorry. Why? What do you have to apologize for? Nothing. But boy, it's a struggle, isn't it? That's why I love that book of Doug Manning's, Don't Take My Grief Away. If you permit yourself to cry in the presence of others, do you know what you're doing? You're educating people about the powerful loss that you've experienced. You're helping them learn by visualization, by observation, that this is really a very difficult mental and emotional experience. It's really changed your life. Withholding those expressions of grief causes people to continue to be ignorant. And it's important for us to just go ahead and cry when we feel the need to cry. God gave us the ability to cry for a reason. Now, there are other people. Do you know there are people who can't cry? There are actually people organically, physiologically, they can't cry. Now, if you're supposed to be crying but you're not crying, how does that make you feel? You're guilty again. I mean, you can't win. You're just all over the map and struggling with all kinds of contrary notions and feelings. Miss Claudia, you were going to say something?
I was just going to say that, you know, you have people who would say things like, it's been 20 years, get over it.
It's been 20 years, get over it. Note to attendees, you do not get over it. Okay? There is, we use this phrase, we want closure. Closure is at your death. You need to learn to live with the loss. Embrace the loss and learn to live with it without it identifying you. I am a widower, but a widower is not who I am. I am a senior citizen. I know I don't act like one, okay? But I am a senior citizen, but a senior citizen is not who I am. A cancer patient, they recover. I'm a cancer survivor, but that's not who I am. Don't let the things that you experience in this life become your identity. Your identity is one thing, your relationship with God.
Amen.
You exist in His image and after His likeness. If you're a Christian, you're a child of God. That is your identity. Don't let anything else be your identity. You may be someone's husband or someone's wife, but when they die, that relationship no longer exists. You are not their spouse anymore. You may feel like it, but the Bible says in Romans 7, you're released, you're free. That marriage no longer exists. It's not forever. It's not eternal. But you may struggle with feelings about it. Don't let the things you experience become your identity. There are tears and no tears that we talked about. There's heartache because this is awful. Awful things cause us to ache inside of us. And you begin to have questions. You're going to question yourself, have self-doubt. Many, many people tell me, I thought I was going crazy. Well, but they weren't. They were grieving. And that's a part of the grieving process. It's not uncommon to have a lot of self-doubt about who you are. You may have questions about your church family who are not being responsive to how you're feeling. And you may have questions about God. And you may begin to struggle with your relationship with God and struggle with your relationship with your brothers and sisters in the Lord. And that's okay to have that struggle, because that struggle is like going to the pain terrorists. It's going to cause you to work hard, and eventually you're going to get to a better place if you don't give up. It's okay to have a lot of questions and concerns, and if you have questions and concerns about God, then you need to go talk to God about that. And you need to let Him talk to you. And you need to let other people who know God help you, because sometimes God's best way of helping us is through His people, and we need to address those questions that are so important in our life, especially the ones that are faith-based in nature. The loneliness is off the chart. That's the only way I can describe it. It's just off the chart. Let me share with you about Kathy Lee Gifford. You know, NBC Today Show?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, she's my age, by the way. I found out. She was married to Frank Gifford. Now, when I was a kid, I watched Frank Gifford on a black and white TV in Columbus, Ohio, run the football for the New York Giants. He was a great football player. Now, they were both married previously, and they got married, and they were married for 29 years. Now, he died in 2015. What I love about Kathy Lee Gifford is, though she was very well known, she was very transparent about what a mess it was after Frank died. And let me share with you a couple of things. In an AARP magazine that I read, now you're wondering why would Dean be reading AARP magazines, and I appreciate the compliment, okay? But I did happen to find it laying around, and it was an article where they were interviewing her. And one of the questions that came up was about loneliness after Frank's death. Here's what she said. My loneliness was, quote, crippling loneliness. She didn't say she was lonely. She said my loneliness was crippling loneliness. The Tennessean, which is the major news media in Middle Tennessee, they did an interview with her. You can find this on YouTube, by the way, an interview with Kathy Lee Gifford. And one of the things that they talked about was why in the world, she was asked, why did you move from New York City down to Williamson County to Franklin, Tennessee? She said, quote, I moved here because I was dying of loneliness. I have a friend in Middle Tennessee. Her name is Anita. She was married to a preacher. He suddenly died. She posted one day on Facebook, the loneliness is suffocating. That is loneliness on steroids. That is hard to deal with. Probably the greatest challenge for a widowed person is dealing with that. The fact that you're not alone because you have the Lord, but your feeler feels so alone because there's nobody around like there was before. It is an agonizing problem to deal with. The identity crisis that we have talked about, you're not that person's husband or wife anymore, and you permitted that to become your identity. You loved introducing yourself as somebody's wife, somebody's husband, but you're not that anymore. And so you struggle with who you are. The financial jeopardy is very possible. Do not be naive and think that our Social Security system is the perfect safety net for widowed people. You are both ignorant and naive, and I don't mean that as a criticism, it's just a fact. You are ignorant and naive if you think that. I made a mistake with the Social Security system after my wife died. And you talk about complicated, because I ended up talking to somebody on the phone from the Social Security Administration who I thought and trusted knew what they were saying, and it was right.
naive and.
I was naive and inexperienced, and it came back to bite me to the tune of a few $1,000s. We need to realize that there can be financial jeopardy, especially even with our brothers and sisters in the Lord, after the death of their spouse. You're having to deal with forced change, and we don't like to have things forced on us. We are citizens of the United States of America. We live in a free country, and we don't like being forced to do anything. But life doesn't care about where you live. Life gifts you blessings, and life gifts you burdens, and sometimes you're stuck with some things that you don't like, and it's hard to deal with that reality. And you have to deal with the absence of that person. Now, just like at church where you have assigned seating, at home you have assigned seating. Now, when you look at the assigned seat of your spouse, who's no longer there, what do you see? That sight of that absence is powerful. Because you have become accustomed, your brain has become accustomed, that when your eyes turn that direction, at that chair or that place, you see that person. And it is a harsh reality to deal with the absence of that person. I'm not even done yet. You're also going to have to deal with dreams. It is not uncommon, years and years and years after the loss of somebody, not just a spouse, but anybody else, to have dreams about that spouse. My daughter, just a few weeks ago, had a dream about her mother. Her mother's been gone for over 10 years. And she had a dream that involved her mother. Now, that doesn't mean that she has not recovered. That doesn't mean that she's not all right. That means she's human. Now, my suspicion is, well, I can tell by talking with you all in a group, some of you all have a hard time controlling your brain. Okay? It's evidenced by when you speak. Okay? Now, no offense. I just report facts in my ministry. Okay? Now, we have trouble controlling our brain when we're awake. Now, when we go to sleep, how much control do you have on your brain? It's going to go anywhere it wants to. Now, if you've been locked in to this relationship with somebody, whether it be a child or a spouse or somebody else, if you've been locked into this relationship for decades, your brain still has that person registered up here between your ears. And if your brain wants to go there at night, it's going to go there at night. You have no control over your brain. That is not some indication that you're going crazy or you need professional help. There are other indications you may need professional help, but that's not one of them. That's a very common issue. We have to embrace that reality of that experience. The silence can be deafening. One thing that a widowed person doesn't have to ever worry about in their marital status is having to shout to the other person in another part of the room, "Honey, would you please be quiet? I'm on the phone now." Or, "What are you doing? What in blue blazes are you doing over there? You're making so much noise out there." You don't have the problem of noise. You have the problem of silence. And the silence can be deafening. Let me tell you about the sister I met who confessed to me that in the morning, every morning, first thing she turns on the TV, and that TV runs until the time she goes to bed, not because she watches it, just because when she's in the house, she wants noise. That's a very common thing among people who've lost their marriage. The emptiness you feel is very real because that person helped to fill up your life. And now you have a dependence you need to recognize. You need help. You need to admit that fact. When Brother Danny lost his wife, and let me tell you about how they rolled. She was in her early 80s when she died. Here's the way they rolled in their marriage. She did everything in the house. He did everything out of the house. She had to worry nothing about anything outside the house. He didn't have to worry about cooking, cleaning, taxes, insurance. She took care of all that. She up and died on him. You talk about a mess. You talk about a lonely little puppy who needed help. That old boy was in such need that he called the preacher for recipes because he didn't know how to cook. I was his preacher. That's how I know that. I loved to cook. He knew that. He knew I had a lot of recipes. You just need to recognize the fact that you need and be willing to accept help and request help if necessary. The stress level is incredible and the anger is very real. Who are we going to be angry at? Our spouse has passed away, so let's make a list of people that we want to be angry at. Somebody get us started. God? You're going to get God and him? So you're married you married this man, you loved him dearly, he died, now you're mad at him and you're mad at God. Whew! Man, what a place to start. In Titusville, Florida, Jackie confessed that when she was in the shower, there were times she was so frustrated and so angry, she'd pound the side wall of the shower and say, "Why did you leave me? Why did you leave me?" She wasn't going crazy. She was grieving. She was angry at her husband because he had died. It's not an uncommon thing. Now, you can be angry at God. God let that happen. God did let that happen. We're going to talk more about that tomorrow, Lord willing, but God did let that happen. And if you have a kid, if you have a little kid in your life and they're mad at you, who would you want them to come talk to? What'd be the best thing? They should come to you, right? Because you can talk about all that and maybe even have a better relationship after talking about that very transparently. Where do you think you ought to go if you're angry at God? You need to go to his book and listen to him. You need to go to worship and praise him. And you need to spend time on your knees praying to him in desperation, seeking his help because he is your best help. So we're going to be angry at the person who passed away. We're going to be angry at God. Who else you want to be angry at? Myself. Now you're going to be angry at yourself. Let me tell you about Vanita. Vanita, the first conversation I had with her, she lived in Kansas. And she called and she said, in the course of the conversation, I got COVID. Here was basically the conversation. I got COVID. I gave COVID to my husband. I survived. And I killed him because I gave him COVID. Sometimes a caregiver will self-inflict with guilt, thinking that if they'd done something differently, this wouldn't have happened. And there's no perfect caregiver. I was one for 8.5 years. There's no perfect caregiver. But sometimes you can be angry at yourself. How about the medical profession? Bobby Denton is a brother in the Lord who is a historic figure in the state of Alabama. He was a state senator longer than any citizen of the state of Alabama in its history. He was a state senator longer than anybody else was in the history of that state, a member of the Lord's church. He had to take his wife for a surgery, and it was just a typical normal surgery. Hey, by the way, let me define this thing of, how do we distinguish surgeries? There's minor and major, right? Okay, minor surgery is somebody else. Now, if somebody operates on me, it's major. I don't care what they call it, it's major. Anything done to me is major surgery. And he was taking his wife just for a normal thing. And he never got to take her home because of what happened in the OR. Man, he was a mess after that. Lives in the Florence, Muscle Shoals area of Alabama. You can be angry at the medical profession. Having anger after the loss of somebody really precious in your life is a pretty normal thing. But we need to deal with it, recognize it and deal with it. You're going to have worry and you're going to have fear because your life's been turned upside down. What in the world are you going to do now? This person's no longer in my life. They were a significant part of my life. I'm miserable and I'm struggling. And then you've got the fact that there's going to be restlessness. You're going to be tossing, you're going to be turning because of the fact your life is just not normal. It's not the way you want it to be, and you're forced to deal with this, and you're a mess. Now, Chester, West Virginia. First place I ever tried to do a workshop like this. This list was probably 35% of the number it is now. And after we had this session, this fellow came to me, bald head, wire rim glasses, the glasses about the thickness of the old Coke bottle. And tears were starting to form in his eyes. And he said, "Brother, I've got something else I'd like to suggest that you add to that list." And I said, "Well, what is it?" And he said, "Suicidal thoughts." Now, don't be naive and don't be ignorant. Tomorrow morning, if you come here and we're in this room and we're worshiping together, don't be naive and think that there aren't people in this room who are in some real difficult time in their life, who may be dealing with baggage, a burden, and experience that has got them living on the edge, where they may have had, in recent times, maybe even that week previous, suicidal thoughts. There are way more suicidal thoughts than there are suicides. The things that we experience can have such a powerful impact on us that they can cause us to think about things where we're actually concerned about our welfare and the welfare of others in our presence. Why in the world would this be so difficult? I hope I've described for you a situation that's very challenging. Well, this is a unique relationship. The only one in the Bible, the only human relationship described like this, one flesh. Now, if you're married, I'm going to drill down a little bit deeper. I want to bring a point up here. I searched the internet for this, and I know it's right because I read it on the internet. Okay? Now, I've seen it some other places too, so I've had it confirmed. I know this is true. There are over 8 billion people on planet Earth. Now, my little brain has a hard time comprehending that number. Sometimes as high as 8.5 billion people on planet Earth. How many people are in your marriage? If that doesn't impress you with how special your marriage is, what in the world would? On a planet of 8 billion plus people, you and that one other person are the only people in that relationship. That is a special relationship. And when you lose that blessing, a special blessing like that, that's why you're going to be a mess. And you need to recognize that ahead of time and realize the severity of the storm that you're about to be in. Flawed people are the only kind of people in a marriage, but flawed people can have a magnificent marriage. Here's how you do it. This is why widowhood is so difficult. This is what we need to practice in our lives, and this is what we need to teach our children and our grandchildren. It is the recipe for a magnificent marriage. Total giving of the total self for a total lifetime. That's the reason why the marital statistics are so sad in our culture. People are not buying in. There is a genuine, thoroughgoing disrespect for the holy matrimony that marriage is. And people want to bail before death. When two people say, total giving of the total self for a total lifetime, no matter what they experience in their life, and they're going to be hard times, they are going to be able to cope with it because of that deep and profound commitment to that marriage. You lose that, you're going to be a mess. Don't you dare say to a widowed person, I know how you feel, unless you want to be slapped, because you cannot know how that other person feels for a number of different reasons. For instance, people are individuals and relationships are different. Some marriages are really good. There are 3 kinds of marriages. There are miserable marriages, there are mediocre marriages, and there are magnificent marriages. Now, what kind of marriage did this couple have? Well, that's going to affect the person left behind. Families are different. Some families talk about a lot of stuff. Some families are very quiet. Some families are highly dysfunctional. what kind of family that's going to affect that person in their widowhood experience. In addition to that, how long was the person married? Do you know? I know of someone who was married to a preacher. They enjoyed over 20 years of marriage. He died. She remarried and married another preacher. And he died 5 months after she married the second guy. 5 months. There are marriages of only a few months and death occurs. Only a few years and death occurs. That's going to be very different than Millie Hartman in the Cincinnati, Ohio area, who married a man and lived with him 63 years, and compare the contrast to when her husband died over in France in the Battle of the Bulge when she was just a teenager. So the length of the marriage matters too. You can't say that you know how they feel. And some people have faith, and that's going to be a tremendous help to them. Some people may have a little faith. Some people may have no faith. And all those things are going to affect the experience of widowhood afterwards. Don't ever say, I know how you feel. I need a fork UPS delivery service. You are it. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to arise, and I want you to look at every person who raises their hand and give them a fork. Now, I want you to raise your hand if you are presently widowed. If you are presently widowed, raise your hand, and he's going to bring you a fork.
Give me a fork.
Okay, give me a fork. I love that take charge woman kind of spirit. Give me a fork. I want you to make sure that you take one of these forks. And let me tell you,
That's a cute fork.
if you want to lose weight, you can eat with it. But that's not why I'm giving it to you, okay? I don't have any business involving myself into your eating habits, okay? Here's the reason I'm giving this fork to you. Let me describe to you what life after the loss of your spouse is like. When you have lost your spouse, a door of your life has been closed that you did not close yourself. That door wasn't just closed, it was slammed shut. And all you can do early on in your deep grief is sit there in disbelief. I cannot believe this has happened. I mean, people can caregive for years, and when that person dies, still have that very same thought. I can't believe this has happened. That's deep grief. All you can do is you just sit there and you stare in disbelief and shock that this has happened to me, that I'm the one left behind, that my husband, that my wife, they have died. It is gut-wrenching. You're going to be in a period of deep grief for however long you need to be in deep grief, and don't let anybody take your grief away. That is a therapeutic time in your life. That is especially an intensive care phase of your life.
Why is that?
Because you're desperate, you're in need.
Yeah, but you don't want to keep on like this.
But isn't it interesting how that I don't want to keep on feeling this way. I don't want to keep on thinking this way. But you keep feeling this way and you keep thinking this way. That's how dominant grief is.
It's like you're in a hole and you can't get out of it.
That's right. And that's the way it's going to be for as long as it needs to be with you. We've got to accept the fact that this is a horrific loss that I've experienced. I am not okay. It's going to be a good time before I'm not okay. I have no idea how long I'm not going to be okay. And you just have to realize that at some point, we're going to talk about this tomorrow, at some point, you can be okay again. But you know what needs to happen? You need to do a lot of grief work. Remember, we mentioned, you got to do a lot of effective grief work. God wants to help you, but you need to work with him to help you. And God has provided opportunities to be helped. I was in misery. I was struggling. I would pray differently than I'd ever prayed before. Literally, physically, on my knees at my bedside. At times, unable to express myself I couldn't make words because I was so emotional. I'm just glad that God can read our hearts. It took me a long time to get to the point where in prayer I could thank the Lord for those 41 years that He blessed me with a wonderful, supportive wife. But I just cracked up emotionally. I wanted to get better, but I felt like I couldn't. But the reality is I could, but my feeler was telling me, no, this is where you need to be. You're just miserable. But that's normal. That's okay. Here's what you've got to do, though. In your grief journey, that loss has put you on a grief journey. Now, on your grief journey, what you've got to realize at some point, okay, I've come to a fork in the road. There's your fork. You've come to a fork in your road. Now, when you pick up a fork, what have you decided to do? I know you're real smart. You can figure this out. These next few questions, they're really easy, okay? But they're not multiple choice and not true false, okay? When you pick up a fork, what are you deciding to do? Eat, okay. With the fork in hand, what decisions are you making? What you're going to eat. Did your mother sell you that story about the starving kids in China? And that's why you needed to eat everything on your plate? Okay. You're an adult now. You don't have to eat everything on your plate. So you pick up the fork because you've decided to eat. With the fork in hand, you've decided what you're going to eat. You've also decided what you're not going to eat. What else are you deciding? How much you're going to eat. When you're ever going to quit eating. Let the fork cause you to think about decisions. You've come to a fork in the road. You're at the point in your life that now you've got to decide what to do. You couldn't think previously during your deep grief, but now you need to decide, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? That's your decision. It's between you and the Lord. What I encourage you to do is take this fork home and lay it somewhere where you'll see it every day. It could be to the left or right of your kitchen sink. Could be on your counter. Could be on your dining room table. Could be where you sit and watch TV at a table nearby. Could be at your nightstand. But every day, look at that fork. And then keep asking yourself, what am I going to do now? What am I doing now? I didn't die. Don't die until you're dead. I didn't die. What am I going to do? And we need to start rebuilding our life. That is so easy to say, and that is so hard to do. Such a terrible struggle. I had no idea that life was this hard for widowed people. And because of that, I neglected the widowed in the church. It wasn't because I didn't care. It was because I didn't know. If I had known, I would have been an active, caring brother in their life. I knew about the powerful impact of loss. I was there when they suffered loss. I shed tears with them. We prayed together. I officiated at their memorial services of their loved ones. What I did not realize was what living with loss was like. I knew about the powerful impact of loss. I didn't know about living with loss every day and every night. Here's the recipe for effective ministry for grieving people. Knowledge plus compassion equals effective ministry. If you have knowledge, but you don't have a compassionate heart, you won't be an effective servant of others. If you have the knowledge, but you don't have the compassion, you're not going to be an effective servant of others. But when we become aware of somebody who's struggling and what they're struggling with, and we do our homework about what it's like to go through something like that in whatever way we can, then with a compassionate heart, we can be effectively serving those other people. We are God's first responders. And so when people are hurting, no matter what they're going through. Don't be pulling that card and play it. You know, this is out of my comfort zone. That's idolatry is what that is. Because that is putting something else above God's will for you in their life. God's will is for you to love them, to be present for them, and to serve them. And when you refuse to do that because it threatens your comfort zone has become your God. Don't let that happen. We have gone longer than I've even anticipated, and I'm not finished, but we're going to finish. I want to thank you for coming. Some of you came both yesterday and today, and I hope that we can be together tomorrow. I promise you tomorrow, if the Lord permits us this opportunity to be together, your heart will be touched, thoughts will be provoked, and you will be a better, stronger child of God. And you will be more equipped to help hurting people than you were before. And really, that's what life's all about. So let's make it a point to be here tomorrow. I really appreciate this church and the opportunity to be here. Jim, do you need to say anything as we close?
When I prayed for the meal, two things came up via text. Jesse Redford was going to come. You know, she lost Harry in early 2023, but she texted me last night. She lost her sister. Or no, her aunt. Mary Husky's sister died yesterday. So she texted and said, it's just too soon, too hard. So pray for Jesse. And also, Ron was going to come. He woke up with a sore throat. So we need to pray for Ron Edwards. So, all right, so let me have a prayer for the meal. And we'll go back there and enjoy this chicken salad soup and all the Lord's calories. Father, we thank you so much for the time together. We praise you for how you use Dean to instruct us, to teach us, to encourage us, to inform us, and to inspire us. We thank you for supplying